something scary, which is philosophy. That's your scary Halloween thing. So yeah, we are going to talk about the philosophical foundations of the Christian worldview. So if you remember last week, we kind of just gave an outline of the whole arc of this series. So we're starting with the philosophical foundations, and then we're moving into the theological, and then we'll look at some of the cultural aspects. Basically, how do we apply our worldview to the culture? And then we'll look at some other approaches to looking at the culture. And it's going to take us all the way into the spring. So we're going to spend a few weeks on the philosophical foundations, and it's pretty nice because we're just switching between different teachers. So yeah, and in fact, some of you probably have questions like, why even do philosophy? And then there are probably others who are really into philosophy and could probably teach this better than I can. So we've got the whole gamut, but I would say that philosophy is important for a number of reasons when we're talking about the Christian worldview. And the first is that philosophy actually influences culture, more so than you may realize. And maybe not as much as it once did, but philosophy influences culture. Francis Schaeffer, I brought his book, but it's still in my bag. Francis Schaeffer talked about how philosophy would influence art, and then art would influence music, and then music would, these are all backwards, sorry. And then music would then influence other media and what he calls general culture. Just general culture. And then that in turn influences a couple different things. That influences theology, which is sad, but it's true. Sometimes theology is really influenced by culture. But then also politics. Politics is downstream of culture. Okay, so it may seem very abstract to talk about philosophy, but this is really kind of how things move. You have people thinking, and then you have sort of the avant-garde who hang out with the philosophers, and then they start expressing these new ideas through their various art forms, whether it is visual art or music or even movies. And that's some of what we'll talk about later on in the series, is how can we discern some of these philosophical worldview ideas that are present in movies that we watch, because they're there. And Michelle gets really annoyed when I'm like, that movie was existentialism. And she's like, it was a good movie. It was a cartoon. Yeah. So philosophy has a greater impact than we may realize, and so we need to at least be aware of it. Secondly is just the fact that everyone has a worldview, and our worldview can either be undergirded by good philosophy or not, okay? But we have a worldview regardless. And my dad last week quoted Francis Schaeffer, who says that everyone, both the person in the academy and the person working on your plumbing, I don't remember exactly how we worded it, but both of those people have a worldview, right? So we can have a consistent worldview, which philosophy tries to make sense of the world around us in a way that is internally and externally consistent, right? Consistent with itself, but also consistent with the world around us. So we can have a worldview that is undergirded by good philosophy or not. And then the third reason is just as an encouragement. There's actually been a resurgence in Christian philosophy in the last 30 years or so. It used to be that if you talked about philosophy, immediately you thought this is a secular endeavor. No one's doing philosophy from a Christian perspective. You think of people like David Hume, or even, I'm blanking on his name, the English philosopher of the 20th century. Yes, thank you, Bertrand Russell. See, he's the person I had in mind when I said some people probably should be teaching. But yeah, Bertrand Russell or David Hume, you think, oh, these are the philosophers. Well, over the course of the past 30 years, there has been a recovery, a resurgence, where now about 30% of all philosophy professors are Christians. And it's because we have a good case. We have a good case to be made philosophically. So if we can do apologetics if we can defend our faith using science and general revelation, we can also do apologetics and defend our faith using reason and revelation in that way. So that's my case for philosophy. And again, not that I'm the best equipped to do it. I'm mostly self-taught, and so, but hey, I'm the one up here, so there you go. All right, so we're going to talk about this morning, basically, we're going to see the three major categories of philosophy. We're just doing an overview today, all right? I'm going to get our feet in the water, and then over the next few weeks, we'll look at each of these categories more closely. But the three major philosophical categories are metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So we like to use big words. So metaphysics answers questions of reality, being, and essence. Okay, so what is real and what's the nature of being and existence? That's the category of metaphysics. What's real? What's the nature of being and existence? Epistemology deals with knowledge and truth and asks questions like, what is true? How do I know what is true? The theory of knowledge. And then ethics addresses goodness, beauty, morality, and asks what is good and where does morality come from? So, these are the three major categories. I'm going to be throwing around these words a lot. And so try and get this chart in your mind. But metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. A proper worldview accounts for all three of these categories in a way that is consistent. Okay, a proper worldview allows for each of these to interact with each other in a way that's harmonious and not in competition. So you'll see sometimes that people have a worldview that establishes a really good metaphysic, but their ethics are in competition with it, or something like that. Okay, so the Christian worldview, really any proper worldview, which there's only one, which is the Christian worldview, but a proper worldview ought to have all of these categories functioning in harmony with each other. And if you find that your categories are somehow in competition, that indicates that there's something wrong with your worldview. So, for example, a person's views on metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics should be informing one another. And if a person's ethics are in competition with their metaphysics or their epistemology, then they would have what we call a deficient worldview. And as an example, Jordan Peterson, who's a clinical psychologist and a professor at the University of Toronto, he has developed a metaphysical framework that a lot of Christians would recognize. Okay, when you listen to Jordan Peterson talk, some of you may know who he is. When he talks about ethics, for example, you're like, that sounds similar, okay? Because he's talking about ethics from an objective perspective. And you think, okay, we're allied on something. But the problem is he has affirmed objective morality while rejecting the existence of God. And therefore, he has no grounding for the morality that he's articulating. He has a deficient worldview. And he even acknowledges this. Yeah, go ahead.
Roughly 3 years ago, he said he was studying the Bible and decided it was real or not.
Yes, that's right.
So I'm waiting to hear.
We're waiting to hear. And there was a really interesting video that came out over the summer. He's been meeting with a guy who's an Eastern Orthodox person, and they've been getting together to talk about Jesus for many, many months. And he talks about how the story of Jesus, if it's real, is the scariest thing in the world and the most impactful thing in the world. And there's this video where he's moved to tears thinking about the implications of what if Jesus is actually real. But up to this point, he's been unwilling to take that step.
His daughter confessed
Really?
to the Lord recently.
Really?
I believe so.
Okay, that's exciting. So maybe we're close. Maybe we're close. And here's the beauty of it, is that he has established a fairly good ethic. I won't say that it's great, because it can be kind of just moralistic legalism sometimes. But he at least acknowledges that this thing has got to be objective. Like, it just doesn't make sense. They would all be person dependent. And that's leading him into the direction where he's like, okay, but my metaphysics don't align with that. I've denied the existence of God. I've denied a creator. And yet I'm affirming that there is real goodness, that there's real morality. It's not matching. And so he's having to deal with the disharmony of his own worldview. And I think that's what's leading him to God. So here's a quote from him, which I think is interesting. He says, "I'm not arguing for the existence of God." This was in a lecture that he gave called Maps of Meaning. He says, "I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact midair without any foundational support." Okay, and he's exactly right. He's basically saying, okay, we've built an entire society that assumes the existence of God, that has God as its foundation, you might say, and we've built our entire society, not the least of which is our morality, on top of that foundation. But then with the Enlightenment, we came through, and especially in postmodernism, we got rid of the foundation. And he's saying, that's not going to last very long, okay? But he's not arguing for the existence of God. He's like, I'm not saying I believe in God, because he doesn't. But he's just saying, we're in a panic. We've got a real problem. And he's aware of his own problem, that he too has denied the existence of God. But he says, we're onto something with morality. Society had something, and we're losing it. So question then. Yeah.
Based on that, and why did you say metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics in that order?
That's a great question. We're going to get into that.
Okay.
But I can address it now. So metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. The three are interdependent, which is actually my next slide, is that they're really interdependent. Okay? You cannot separate them. And they, as I'm arguing, all are bound up in the very existence of God. So for example, if we're going to talk about metaphysics being the question of reality and existence, we're saying, well, God exists as creator. Okay, God exists before anything else exists, and he creates everything else that exists, and that's our metaphysics. But it doesn't just stop there, because again, this is why my drawing's going to get pretty crazy. But if we're saying that there's a such thing as truth, well, truth is understanding what exists, right? So our epistemology has to intersect with our metaphysics, because epistemology is, how do I know the thing that exists, if that makes sense. But then we know that God is truth. So God is the author of all things that exist. God is truth, and so he's the author of all that we know. And then ethics. Well, if there are no metaphysics, if there are no metaphysics, then ethics are just a construct, because there's no real reality. Or let's say there are metaphysics, but our epistemology is off, and we say, well, even if ethics do exist, there's no way we can know they exist, right? So they're all intersecting right here in the person of God, who is good, who is truth, who is creator, okay? So from a logical standpoint, we begin with metaphysics because it all starts with the one who is.
That's what I would sit there and say is the big problem of the Enlightenment. It did not start with that.
It started with epistemology. That's right. We're going to start with epistemology. No, it's true. It's true. It's a big problem. And I really wrestled with it. Where do we start? Because logically, and I'm going to make the case for this. We'll just go out of order. I'll just talk about it now. Logically and philosophically and theologically, it makes sense to start with metaphysics, because God is the one who is. But from the human standpoint, we ask the question, how do we know? How do we know that God exists? And so we sort of have these function as different on-ramps into the philosophical conversation. And what I argue is that everything that we know because God has revealed it to us. So we know that God exists because God has revealed himself.
So
Yeah.
is that not the problem that we have now? Instead of God being in the middle, it's me in the middle, I think, therefore I am, and I make up my own truth. And if I make up my own truth, then what's right and wrong is what I decide it's going to be.
That's right. Yeah. So if our epistemology shifts, then our ethics shift. If our metaphysics shift, then our epistemology shifts. So I'm not saying that we're starting with epistemology because I am the beginning of truth. But what I'm saying is that I only know God exists because he has stepped into the world and revealed himself to me. And so that's why we're starting with epistemology. But it's true. It's very, very, it is the problem of the Enlightenment, is that they started with epistemology because they thought that they were also the ultimate metaphysic. Does that make sense? They started because they said, I can only know that I exist. And outward from myself, I will discover whether or not God exists. That's not what I'm doing when I start with epistemology. I'm assuming the metaphysic when I start with epistemology. Does that make sense? So it's for didactic purposes. It's not a philosophical position I'm making. Yeah.
You go back to Plato and Socrates and did the same thing.
Starting with epistemology? Yes, that's right. They basically argued that we have this dark world that we can perceive, and then they constructed a whole metaphysic based on the thing that they could perceive, right? So yeah, I'm starting with the assumption that God is the author of all metaphysics, but then I am beginning on that assumption. I'm starting with epistemology just because, yeah, because I'm up front. There you go. But that's a very good question. And I'm glad that you guys are thinking about these things, because I was trying to decide, like, well, do I weigh these people down by talking about my methodology for why am I starting with epistemology? Well, I'm glad that I prepared that because you guys are on top of it. But yeah, so let's just talk for a minute about these three categories. I've already talked a little bit, but the three categories of philosophy are interdependent because they intersect in God himself. They are interdependent because they intersect in God himself. So God exists, and he's the creator of all things. God is truth, and knowledge can only correspond to what actually exists. Therefore, epistemology addresses how we understand metaphysics and just the world around us. And then ethics depend on knowledge and truth. If there's no metaphysic, neither are there ethics. If there's no knowledge, there are no ethics. So we need to construct a worldview that sees these categories in harmony. And so poor Jordan Peterson, he's down here, okay? Poor guy. He's removed God, and his metaphysics are off. So he's just hanging out at the bottom, which you can't really even do. It's actually a bad graph because he's tried to lift metaphysics out, and you can't do that. He's correct in some areas, but he's correct only insofar as he's inconsistent with his broader worldview. We don't want that to be true of us. The truth is that we can be philosophically grounded in everything that we say because we are talking about truth, and God is truth. So, we'll talk about some worldview breakdowns. And first, I just want to contrast the Christian worldview with some non-Christian worldviews, just in some bullet points. This isn't very lofty or anything. These are just things to think about. So, the Christian worldview says that God exists as creator and has designed things with specific purpose. By contrast, non-Christian worldviews say there is no God, there is no purpose. Okay? Truth is objective and unchanging, or truth is relative to individuals, cultures, and time. Right? That's true for you. Truth is knowable on account of God's revelation to mankind, or truth is knowable on account of human faculties alone. And this was kind of what we were talking about, the Enlightenment breakdown, was that I could know truth from within myself. Morality is objective and unchanging, or morality is relative to individuals, cultures, and time, right? Those are sins in the Old Testament, right? But that was 3,000 years ago. Things have changed. Morality is knowable on account of God's revelation to mankind. And I don't have an antithesis for that. So now let's look at examples of an inconsistent Christian worldview. Because here's the thing. Although we're Christians and we're talking about worldview, each and every one of us has a deficient worldview because we're fallen. Okay, and so we have gaps in our thinking. We say things that if you really were to stop and think about it, like that does not fold into the Christian worldview, right? Now these hopefully, probably none of you would say, but maybe you do, and maybe it'll get you thinking. Okay, so yeah, I believe in Jesus, but who am I to say that someone is wrong for believing in Allah? Okay, we have a metaphysical and epistemological error there, because we're saying, yeah, there might be two gods, or this one God has multiple natures, the nature of Allah and the nature of Yahweh. And we have an epistemological error that, well, God revealed the truth to me, but is it really the truth? I mean, maybe the Quran is also true. Okay, so we have an error of metaphysics and epistemology.
Don't you think that that's like what Paul said, that the unknown God, his name, when he came into the preaching there,
So,
that they had a statue to the unknown God?
yes. What are you saying, that that's like this? Or, okay.
He used it as a pivot point to point out there is no other God.
Right.
There is only one.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. And it's actually really interesting because he quotes like Stoic philosophers in that speech in Athens. It's a really good example of speaking to people where they are. But yeah, he's like, look, you guys, I mean, if you think about the Stoics, the idea that there would be something unknown is very troubling for them, right? Because knowledge is the key. I'm supposed to sit and know. And that's the end point of humanity in the Stoic worldview, is that I just have to know. And I don't indulge things, I just think and know. And so very troubling for them that there was an unknown God. At the same time, however, it was also sort of I'm just covering myself. You know, I'm worshiping all these other gods, but maybe there's another one. Just in case, yeah. But he says, hey, you've got an unknown God? No, it's the real God. It's the one from whom, and he quotes their own philosophers, in whom we live, move, and have our being. So yeah, very good. Yeah, I believe the Bible, but some of it's a little dated, right? Homosexuality may have been wrong 2,000 years ago, but I don't really think it is anymore. So we have an epistemological and ethical breakdown. I think Jesus was a good teacher, and I live by his ethical teachings. This is really what it means to follow Jesus. We have a metaphysical and epistemological breakdown. Yeah. It's also kind of just college kids. I believe in God, but I don't think my life really has a purpose. I'm just trying to enjoy life, and I think God just wants me to be happy. So a metaphysical and ethical breakdown. Metaphysical, because I do exist with purpose. I've been created for him, by him, through him, and for him. And then ethical, that God just wants me to be happy. And whatever it is that makes me happy, that's what God wants. So ethical breakdown. All right, so now some examples of an inconsistent non-Christian worldview. All right, so we can be inconsistent in those ways, but non-Christians are notoriously inconsistent. And here's how. First of all, I don't believe in God, but I think truth is so important. We have to pursue the truth, right? You look at their truth. Or, they might even say, no, like, I want the truth. But then, how do they go? Yeah. So you talk to a non-believer who is just so perturbed about the fake news phenomenon, just all this fake news. I just want the truth. You don't believe in truth, right? You don't believe that there's anything objective in the world because you've rejected the God who made the world. And we'll talk about this next week, about why that's the case. Why, if you remove God, you've also removed objective truth. It's a bold claim at the front, but it's a substantiated claim. I just want to speak my truth. But also, if you oppose homosexuality, you're a bigot, right? Like, oh, no, it's just true for me. But you're a bigot. I don't believe that there's a such thing as absolute truth, but also there is no God. Is that one true?
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, there's a great, if someone denies absolute truth, just ask, is it absolutely true that there's no absolute truth? Well, yes, but that's the only one. We have all evolved from amoebas and are merely advanced animals, but also human beings are just so valuable and beautiful, and racism is a great evil. You think about that, because the reason that these are interesting is because there is truth in some of what they say, right? We've got to pursue the truth. There is a such thing as human value. Racism is a great evil. So what happens is that people are touching on something that's real because they live in God's world. They brush up against the reality of the world God has made constantly. And so they make claims that are consistent with the world, but are not consistent with their own worldview. So racism is patently, obviously evil, and yet they have no grounding for saying so, because their worldview says that they just came from nothing and are going to nothing.
So from an evolutionary point of view, I would argue racism can't be evil. It's simply an element of evolution.
Yeah.
Okay? You're
Yeah.
going to argue that evolution is evil because it created something evil. It just is.
Exactly. You can't even put a moral marker on it. You can't say it's good or bad. It just is. Racism is. Yeah, and if you think about it from the perspective of an evolutionary scheme where it is survival of the fittest, it's the powerful defeats the weak. I mean, how do you justify that racism is wrong? And this is what's sad, is that in a lot of ways, we as Christians have ceded the conversation to unbelievers on issues of ethics in our society. You might say, have we ceded it or have they taken it? It's probably a little bit of both. But we actually have a platform, a foundation, who is God himself, upon which we can stand and say that racism is really wrong. But they don't, and they're the ones talking about it. So
I'm not going to argue anything other than we absolutely ceded it.
Yeah.
Just looking at borrowing the term evolution, a philosophy and its intersection to Christianity, Christians adopted stuff whole cloth.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Yep. That's good.
I think, the one that, I don't know about the rest of you, the one that I run into the most is they want to push science. Forget whether you agree with the science or anything around what's going on with our weather and with everything else. And so I'm like, all right, let's talk the science of that, but I'd like you to explain the science of genders. Because I know a lot of doctor friends, even non-Christian doctor friends, who said there's basically two. That's the way God made them. And now they don't say that. That's my ad. But
yeah.
But then they're like, no. A person, that's how they feel or what they choose. And I'm like, then the science, then you can't claim science for this other thing. And that's where it drives them crazy and me crazy too. They're like, sure it can. Science, this is all science. It's just a different kind. I'm like, but they pick and choose where they want to apply. Right. Versus having, if you will, the absolutes that we're trying to talk about.
And if we're not careful, we can do the same thing.
Sure. We
can ignore certain things that. So I at one of the men's breakfasts a while back, I talked about, is science the source of truth? Yeah. No. However, that doesn't mean that science is useless. Science is the pursuit of truth, and as long as we're pursuing truth, we should be comfortable with it because God is truth.
And
He's going to reveal it. That doesn't mean that every scientific conclusion is true, but it means that as long as, and it's not always doing it, but as long as science is pursuing the truth, we should be on board with that. Sometimes it's not pursuing the truth. Sometimes it's pursuing an agenda. But yeah, it's a great point that, they cry science, and then they deny XY chromosomes, So, yeah.
Part of that, too, is because the spirit of the age.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're in that time of the strong delusion that he has sent, not only to unbelievers, but I think a lot of the church is in that strong delusion. And I think that part of that has to be indicative of how powerful we need to stand on the fact that he is the I am.
Yeah, and you think about, what was the culture in which Paul was speaking? When he goes to Corinth, where it's just utter debauchery. And he goes to Athens, where they're carried away by Stoicism and Gnosticism. And he goes to Rome, where it's political idolatry and all the rest of it. I mean, the world was not so different. You know, we go through these ebbs and flows of society and culture. And it's very easy to get swept away by the cultural milieu in which we're living. It becomes the water that we swim in, and it's very difficult. And that's why, you know, Paul says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Another thing is, like, going back to your model, that it seems like all that science can really answer for us is the epistemology and metaphysics. Where do they cross over?
Yeah.
It's only observable.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. So, arbitrary or inconsistent. The atheist has only these two options. They can either be arbitrary or inconsistent. So, the atheist can be arbitrary by making a moral or truth claim without any foundation, such as racism is evil. Well, that's arbitrary, because where does evil come from? What's your foundation for goodness, right? So they're just being arbitrary within their own worldview. But at least they're being consistent with the world in which they live, right? Because they live in God's world. But they can be inconsistent. And when I say this, I don't mean internally inconsistent. I mean externally inconsistent, meaning that they have become inconsistent with the world they live in. So they can deny the existence of morality, truth, or human value, but thereby they would live inconsistently with the way the world actually is. And so a great example of this is our friend Richard Dawkins. And he says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Very well done.
Yeah.
Wayne would be proud.
He'd be so proud. And, okay, you first read this quote as a Christian and you think, ooh, you bristle a little bit because, I mean, that's a strong claim. There's a lot in there. And it's easy when we're talking to unbelievers for them to lob something like this and, you feel like, well, now I'm on the defensive, right? Well, they've knocked me back a step because, well, the God of the Old Testament, sometimes we read the Old Testament and if we're not well grounded, we read things and we're like, how does that fit in? And so then we read something like this, or we talk to somebody who raises some of these allegations against our God, and we think, okay, that's difficult. It can knock us back. However, when you think about the worldview, what is Dawkins actually saying? He says that God is fictional, but he's evil. Right? God is fictitious, but there is a such thing as moral evil, and God is evil. Now, again, this doesn't mean that it's wrong to call a fictional character evil, right? I mean, like, Voldemort's evil, okay? Thanos is evil, okay? So we can look at characters in fiction and attribute moral labels on them. That's not the problem. The problem is that if he denies the existence of God, then there is no such thing as evil. Okay, it's not just that he says he's fictional, but he's evil. It's that he's denying the one from whom morals come. But then he calls him evil. So he has a worldview breakdown. He's being inconsistent with himself. He's being arbitrary.
If he denies the existence of God, then the person he just described doesn't exist.
Right.
So why bother?
Yeah, it's true.
Why worry about something that doesn't exist, that will never happen?
Yeah, it's like there is no God and we hate him.
That's my argument. That's my argument with most atheists. It's like, why do you care? Well, because you're misled. I'm like, then let me be misled. I'm cool with that, but it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I thought where you were going to go with 2 slides back, where they live inconsistently, was the quote by C.S. Lewis, which again, atheists are inconsistent until they live in a world that actually is consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And Lewis, of course, basically sitting there saying that as soon as there's something that's unjust that happens in their lives, all of a sudden the world changes.
Right.
Sorry about that.
No, that's good.
But that's the same thing you see with this guy too. It's interesting. It's the other half of that same deal, right?
Right.
Who's Richard Dawkins? Why do we give him credibility?
Yeah, he's an evolutionary biologist who has very poor philosophical training for sure. And yeah, it is a strange thing. Most of his writings have been refuted by people who are seriously engaged in the philosophical arguments. Now,
Actually, in the scientific argument.
in the scientific arguments, yeah, he's
So basically, he's a nut. Is that what it is?
But he's a so here's the deal. He's a well-spoken, well-educated person.
and he writes well.
And when you get Christians, and I've heard this from more than one person who said there are plenty of Christians, they need to just shut up, okay? Because they're not good at what they're talking about, and they end up making him look like a genius.
That's right. But you can tell Dawkins refuses to debate William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig has invited him on multiple occasions, and he very spitefully won't do it under the guise of, I only debate scientists. Yeah, okay. But it's interesting to see the people he will talk to and the people he won't talk to, and it shows his hand a little bit. But it's true that we give him a lot more credit than he deserves. And that's part of the point here, because he says in another place, I should have put it up here, but he basically says that because he has denied the existence of God, there is at bottom nothing. No good, no evil, only blind, pitiless indifference. But God's malevolent. So even he acknowledges that if he will flat out say, of course there's no morality because there's no God. It's not. I think sometimes as Christians we think, well, these are really bold claims because we live with the presupposition that of course there's right and wrong. So then when you say if you deny God, you must therefore also deny right and wrong, as Christians, if we haven't really studied these things, we think, well, that's pretty bold. I mean, I don't know. But then when you start reading themselves, what do the philosophers say? What do the atheist scientists say? They're like, well, of course there's no morality. It's not even, I mean, that's assumed when you go into a debate. Yeah.
Yeah, what he's trying to do is to show what he perceives to be our inconsistency, which is
right.
We believe there's good and evil, and that good and evil derives from a God and from the Bible, and yet this God is not consistent with his own morality.
The problem is what he says about the God of the New Testament.
It's the same God, though. But yeah.
What he's leaving out is the third person, the Hitler, who takes his assumptions and runs with them and does things that he would hopefully disagree with.
Yeah, and if all he wanted to do was say, Christians, it seems like you have a hole in your worldview. It seems like you claim morality, but the God you claim doesn't seem so moral. Okay, fair criticism. Let's talk about it. But that's ultimately not what he's doing. You can see the utter hatred that he has for God, and it shines through when he talks about it. So, yeah.
So based on his philosophy, could he argue against my assaulting him?
He would say,
there's no wrong.
He would say that it's not good for the species.
Evolution would argue.
Oh, it might be.
But yeah, it's true. I mean, it's a big gaping hole. Yeah.
What a sad life this man has in the future that is at the end of it. As much as I can't stand what he has to say, he will stand before a holy God one day and understand that he has no hope. And so,
Yeah.
we get that as we don't like him. But
That's right. We
I'll
should,
take my ending over his.
and we should pray for this man because he's not our enemy. It sometimes seems like it when he puts out quotes like this, or when he goes out on stage and has a public forum. We think, oh, that's the guy that we've got to. No, we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, but with evil world forces, spiritual powers. Right? He's he's deluded. He's been blinded by the God of this world.
So it seems like what he's angry with here is not God, because clearly he says God does not exist. But he's angry at the people who have, in his mind, created this kind of God.
I think he's angry at God. I do. But well, anyway, let's move on. So again, the atheist can only be arbitrary or inconsistent, but the Christian can both have a foundation and be consistent with the way the world actually is, and that's because we live in God's world. There's no escaping it. We live in God's world. So the Christian worldview is consistent with the way the world actually is, and that's the key. Okay. There's a friend of mine named Alan Campbell, and he's a pastor over in the UK, but he and I have worked together. I used to do missions in the UK. He's come to the States to help out with stuff that we were doing when I was in college ministry. But he likes to use the metaphor of boats or paper bags. But we'll just use a boat. So those are boats. So there's the Christian worldview, okay? And in our Christian boat, we have truth and we have ethics, okay? And so we stand here happy in our boat. Dawkins is over here. Dawkins is sailing in the atheist boat, and he's angry. He's shaking his poor little fist, okay? But what happens is, for him to say that God is evil, he must leap out of the boat, swim into this boat, assume ethics, and say, God is evil, and then jump back. Right? Because evil, there's nothing. His worldview is plunging because there's nothing. There's no, it's turtles all the way down. That's right. You're the one who taught me that concept, you know. There's nothing substantiating. The Christian worldview rests on the existence of God, but the atheist worldview rests on nothing. There's no water under the boat, let's say, okay? But he leaps out, assumes our worldview to say that things are wrong, and then jumps back in and says, but there's no God, okay? Or to use the concept of a bag. You know, we have our little worldview bag with all of our goodies, like ethics and truth, and then he leans over and reaches into our bag in order to argue against us. So, like, that's not in your bag.
Isn't that the Socratic method, though?
How do you mean?
Like, you basically assume the other person's worldview, take it to its philosophical limits, and then jump back into your own worldview. That's why I don't believe that.
Okay.
He's not doing it in a way to clarify or ask a question. He's embracing it.
Right. So, you know, I could, like you're saying, assume for the sake of argument that there is no God, and then show him where that leads. But I believe there's a God. Okay, he's assuming for the sake of argument that there's right and wrong, and then he lives like there's right and wrong. This is the way he lives his life. Okay, it's the world in which he operates because he's living in God's world, but he's not living in God's boat. Okay, so we have the right to say, get off my boat. You know, when he gets up here and says that God is a malevolent, sadomasochistic bully, get off my boat. What boat is that? You know? Or God is not great, or is it good? Yeah, I can't remember. But, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't believe in him anyway. That's the subtitle. I wrote a whole book, but I don't believe in it.
Right. Yeah. Again, it's really easy for us to just say, "Oh, this is ridiculous. This guy's," but yeah, not our enemy. So the goal in doing these case studies and talking about people like Dawkins or Jordan Peterson isn't to ridicule them, but to show that, hey, our worldview is stronger. they have significant problems. And if they would be willing to humble themselves and recognize the God who exists, then they would be welcome on our boat, you know?
There's the issue, though. That, when I have this conversation, it comes down to people do not want to admit that they are not the end-all be-all of their decisions of their futures, and that there is someone that is going to give direction.
Yeah.
They do not. I mean, that's the human nature. Is I'm going to rebel against anyone who tries to tell me what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Thomas, there you go. Sad. Now, again, when I say primacy, I talk about the primacy of epistemology. I'm not saying that it's primary. I've already talked about this. The logical order of these categories places metaphysics at the top, since it addresses the issues of existence and reality itself. However, practically, if we're going to talk about it from the human perspective, it may be worthwhile to start from epistemology, since a person's epistemology informs our understanding of metaphysics and ethics. A person cannot argue for what is real or what is good if they don't have a grounding for how they know what is real or good. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's kind of two sides, I think, to philosophy of worldview. What does the individual believe themselves? But there's also a corporate sense to it, right?
Yes.
If I'm going to live in a society with people, we have to have a common ethic that we all live by.
Yeah.
And so to get there, we have to have a common metaphysics in common. But how do we get that metaphysics in common without a common epistemology? So when you're talking to someone else who doesn't have the same worldview, you have to start here.
That's right. Yeah.
You don't have a choice.
Humans, yeah, you said it better than I'll say it, so I'll just leave it there. So, again, we're talking about how do we know what is real or good, and as you're putting it, if we're speaking philosophically, metaphysics has to be the start and has to be primary because God is. But if we're talking about what is our entrance ramp into the conversation with the world, it may make sense to start with epistemology because how do you know what's true? How do you know the claims that you're making? And as we'll see next week, it's because God is truth and he reveals. So from a theological perspective, metaphysics comes first. God exists and creates. But from a human perspective, epistemology comes first because God is truth and he reveals. Now, if I am trying to construct the entire framework, it'd be very dangerous to start with epistemology, right? So in other words, we talked about how we've got these three categories that intersect in God. And if I'm trying to build this whole framework and I start with epistemology, I'm going to have some major, major problems. But I'm not building anything. I'm taking the whole structure and saying, let's start here. And I think that's legitimate. But I did wrestle with it because it's true. I mean, the problem with the Enlightenment is they said, okay, I'm going to start here and see what I can build. And they didn't build very well. So, all right, so by way of summary, there are three major philosophical categories, which are metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And a worldview needs to have internal coherence. So each category of a person's worldview should be in harmony rather than conflict. The atheistic worldview must either be arbitrary or inconsistent. And the primacy of epistemology, not in that epistemology is the beginning of the categories, because I would put metaphysics at the beginning. But that, for me, it makes sense to start with epistemology. And if you can be angry at me the whole rest of the time, and it's okay. So, yeah. So that's it. So next time we'll look at epistemology. What's true? How do I know? Thank you. So, any questions or comments? We've got about 10 minutes.
How do we begin a rational discussion with someone who doesn't believe truth is true? That doesn't make sense.
Well, usually irrational, therefore.
Yeah, it won't be irrational.
Step on their foot, and if they cry out and say, well, that was truth,
Yeah.
you know, it's reality, right?
Yeah. Well, think about this. People, it's a mind game, because I used to wrestle with this. I actually had a roommate in college who was an atheist who denied objective truth. All right, so I would try and pin him down, like, is your car white? And he's like, maybe, but someone could look at it and think it's blue. Like, okay, but he's just playing games. It's all deflection. He doesn't think that. And I think that's the point, is that people who embrace relativity are not, it's out of expedience. It's because of the way they want to live. It's not because they see it as actually meshing with the way things actually are. And so I would say that we've got, in Ecclesiastes, it says that eternity has been written on our hearts. In Romans 2, it says that the law has been written on our hearts, and our conscience bears witness to that fact. Romans 1 says that people suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Not that they... So I guess what I'm saying is that they might deny objective truth, but they don't live like it. And I think you start there. Like, well, do you have, like, why do you have a title for your car? Is it because you think it's yours? Because I think it's mine, Like, I'm just going to take it.
Is that traffic light red?
Yeah, why don't you just go?
No,
Right?
why stop?
Yeah.
Colors aren't a good example.
Okay, colors are interesting because if we try and build a framework starting with epistemology, you're going to go really wrong with colors. But if you start with metaphysics, then you can say, regardless of how you, being colorblind, perceive it, the color has a metaphysical reality, which is measured in hertz, So there's an objective thing there. But yeah, if I started with epistemology, you'd be like, no, that just red and green look the same. What are you talking about? So, but the point is, you could say the top light is lighted, is illuminated. Okay, well, there you go. If either it is or it isn't. And people live as though truth exists, and they have to. And I would say, just keep prying until you get them to see that, okay, yeah.
I think this is where the Holy Spirit obviously comes in, because a person, none of us have a completely, as you said at the beginning, a consistent worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So people they will beat them completely in a logical argument, and they will just look at you like, I don't really care.
Right.
So because they made up their mind.
That's right.
And that's what they're going to live by. Now, if the Holy Spirit convicts them and says, look, I'm real, the Trinity is real, and you need us, right? Then that's when their heart will change. But people don't, no matter what they say, they don't seek the truth. They seek the worldview that they want. They look at the way they want it to be, and then come up with reasons why they see it that way. And until we realize that, this is why I used to be huge into apologetics your age. And I'm not looking down on that. But there is a place for apologetics, but I think it's mostly for believers.
Yes.
So that we can be confident in our faith. But there comes a point when apologetics just falls on deaf ears, and more so now than almost ever. And the only place is probably philosophers, because they're actually trying, at least a third of them.
Yes. Yeah, and I think apologetics is, we live in an interesting time where apologetics are more necessary seemingly than ever, because the worldviews are more departed than ever before, and yet probably less effective than ever before at the same time because of the same reason. But I would say that when we're talking about, I cannot argue someone into the kingdom. No, there's no amount of logical reasoning I can use when again, have suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. It's not that they didn't know the truth, and if they find the truth, then they'll say like, oh, well, thanks for telling me. No, they're in a state of rebellion in which they're suppressing the truth, because if they acknowledge the truth for what it is, now they're accountable to a God that they don't want to be accountable to. And so, yeah, you're going to struggle with that the whole time.
The Holy Spirit has to move somebody to come to God, period.
Yes.
And that's the thing. You can argue till you're blue in the face. If he's not active at that point in time, you're not going to see it. Although that might be a step on the road. So it still is worth having the argument.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that'll happen is the real world will come in at some point. You guys, you younger people, probably don't remember 9/11 like we do. But what happened to your church on 9/11 or the week after, 2 weeks after? It filled up. There were overflow crowds because people were put in a position where suddenly they needed God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of what you have to almost count on is for some of those people is for reality to hit them in the face. And now all of a sudden, where do I go with this?
Yeah.
And then the Holy Spirit is going to do whatever he does.
And I think, so there are two things I'll just say real quick about this, is that sometimes the way that you hit someone with reality is by showing how inconsistent they're being. And that can be the thing that puts them over the edge, where they're like, okay, I am a social justice warrior, and yet I have no grounding for saying that racism is evil or that slavery was wrong. Okay, so now what do I do? That for some people can be the impetus that pushes them to say, that doesn't convince me of Jesus Christ per se, but now I have questions, right? On the flip side, I also think, I'll just say I've had personal conversations with someone who didn't even really realize that he had no grounding for objective morality. He thought, like, it doesn't make sense. You don't need God to have objective morality. And again, I'm not saying, well, anyway. So once I explained it to him, he said, oh, okay, that makes sense. I need to think about that. And I think what we can do with these conversations is remove some stumbling blocks, some intellectual barriers that some people really do have. But people also have barriers of rebellion that are there at the same time, and only the Holy Spirit is going to resolve that. So, but yeah, it's a good thing to address it. But like George was saying, what we're primarily, I think it was George, but we're primarily doing this for ourselves. We're in this room talking about foundations of developing a Christian worldview, so that we can live more consistently.
Yeah, I'm not saying we shouldn't do apologetics.
Right.
We shouldn't have these conversations because there will be someone who really is seeking the truth. But I think my experience is when I've had these kinds of conversations with engineers who you would think are people who would value the truth,
Mm-hmm.
it ends the conversation.
Yeah.
So maybe that has plants the seed, but in most cases, just I'm never going to acknowledge. In fact, the argument about only a really a theist can have a solid foundation for ethics. When I've had that, they flip it around and say, "You mean I can't be good?"
Which is not what we're saying.
It's not what we're saying. We're saying no. You have no foundation to even say what good is.
Right.
And they would refuse to even acknowledge that they understood the concept, let alone accept it. So
Yeah.
it's just don't be surprised if you have these conversations
That they fall flat. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't mean we shouldn't have it. Right?
And you better have your heart in the right place. If you're going in looking to win a fight, you already lost it.
That's right.
Because if these conversations come up, it's not about winning or losing. I used to think, and I was fortunate, I had an older brother in Christ tell me, quit trying to sell God.
Mm-hmm.
Does not need a salesman. He just needs you to open your mouth and be you, and all your faults and everything else, and be willing to care about the next person. And I think just like with the guy we were showing, man, I hate what he says. But if I hate him, man, I've completely blown my opportunity to ever talk to anybody like him.
Amen.
So I think, all this knowledge is great, but if your heart is not in the right place when you are seeking to have that conversation, if it's just to win the argument, just keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. If the
I've told me that too. So.
If the fruit of this study is that people become combative and cynical toward unbelievers, then we should probably just close it up.
We won't, keep going.
I'd like to segue from what he was saying. God doesn't need us. He loves us.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't need us to unfold his message. Nobody comes to him unless they're drawn by the Father. So I think our faithfulness is in the study. It is here encouraging one another to love and good deeds and equipping ourselves to get out there. If the harvest is ripe, then why don't we shake off the dust to these who are in opposition and totally close us down?
Yeah.
Well, if God gives you the opening, I don't care who it is, open your mouth. And if they close you down, you don't know the seed that you planted. But I absolutely don't argue anymore. I don't have prolonged, especially when I start seeing them get heated, I'm done. That's not going to accomplish what God's put me here to do. So, but I'm with you.
Yeah.
But I think our guidelines have to be, I think of Moses, and I'll think what Peter said, is Moses was the most humble man in his time, and we're called to be humble. Because Peter says, humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, He will exalt you. So if whenever we're in a situation like that, if we humble ourselves, think less of ourselves, and do whatever we can to lift the other guy up.
Yep. All right. Well, let's end it there.
Do you think it's possible?
No, go ahead.
Do you think it's possible for a Christian to have a non-Christian worldview?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. Now, there's always going to be, it won't be an atheist worldview, because we're saying that God exists, right? And that Jesus Christ is his son. So at least in order to be a Christian, I have to accept the terms of the gospel, right? And to that extent, my worldview will be Christian. However, I would say there are a lot of Christians who have accepted Christ, but then they say things like, well, the Old Testament, I don't know about some of that stuff. Or, well, I really think God is just love, and so some of these, I don't want to judge people for their sins. And very quickly, a born-again person can start saying things that use the Bible as a platform for their secular perspective. So, legalism, yeah.
Where Christians are trying to make Christianity more appealing to this non-Christian world, and so they will sacrifice biblical truth in an effort to try to make it more.
Yeah, I would say, and this is where I'm teaching another section of this series where I'm talking about some specific secular worldviews, such as existentialism or nihilism or moralism. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that we have inculcated some of these secular worldviews. I would argue that most Christians are, to some extent or another, existentialists, because that's the world we're living in. And we'll talk about what that is later. But there's a really good book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's very in vogue among seminarians right now. But it's I would really recommend it because he talks about how there's this whole sexual revolution and we're not immune to it. The whole perspective of the individual above the community, that everything that I do to exist is to find my own purpose, which is existentialism. That the purpose of my job is to find personal fulfillment. That my fulfillment is not found in having provided for my family, but in that I was gratified by the work that I did, or any number of things like that. That we've adopted a psychological perspective of the self that is a worldview breakdown because it's not consistent with what the scriptures actually say about who we are, what our purpose is, and how we're fulfilled. But Christians walk around all the time with those ideas. So, okay, yeah, we'll end here. Let me pray. You know that we're done because someone prayed, so let's pray. God, just thank you for who you are, that you have created us, revealed yourself to us, that you are good, that you call us to be good, and you enable us to be good. And I just pray that you would keep us humble as we study, that we would not be moved by how smart we are, but how magnificent you are. And help us to become hypersensitive to where we might not be consistently living with what you've revealed to us. Help us to be more of who you are and less of who we were. And I just pray that you would use me and others during this series to help us do that. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.